Hello, everybody out there. My name's Thomas Price. I am a master sommelier and national director of wine education for Jackson Family Wines. It is my honor and pleasure to be able to present some really, really unique wines and two of our most gifted and awesome winemakers today. We've got a bunch of really cool stuff to talk about. I'll go north to south. We'll start with Chris Carpenter, who is the winemaker at Lokoya and also Mount Brave and Lokoya and Cardinale and a few other little wineries in our portfolio. And then Mr. Greg Brewer, who's a little further south down in Santa Rita Hills in the Santa Barbara area. And we're going to talk about the wines of Brewer-Clifton with him. We have a dynamite lineup for you guys, and we'll kind of go through them. I'll let these guys talk in a second. I do want to mention that we have Ryan Hughes, who I just found out is a Delaware Blue Chicken. That's a whole nother story. He's manning the chat box for us, and we'll probably jump in if there's anything that the three of us miss. I'll make my role in this very simple. I'm just here to kind of moderate the panel, sip on some of these great wines with these gentlemen, and kind of try to be a low-rent version of David Letterman or Stephen Colbert. So without further ado, I want to let these guys speak to their wines on their own. I do a lot of these where I am kind of carrying all of the information stuff, but we have the sources of the information here. So I'm going to throw it to Mr. Chris Carpenter to kind of introduce himself and talk a little bit about, what we're going to do today and where he's from and all that kind of stuff. So Chris, take it away.
Hi, and thanks all for being on the call today. Hopefully you'll learn a lot and have some fun and get to taste some good wines. I make wine here in the Napa Valley. I make 4 wines, well, actually 5 now. Cardinale, Lokoya, Caledon, Mount Brave, Lokoya. I'm also very privileged to be able to go down to Australia and make a wine called Hickenbotham in the McLaren Vale in Australia. One of the things I wanted to chat a little bit about is our path to winemaking. So I'll give you a brief introduction of that, and then we'll jump into Greg and some of his wines. I am originally from Chicago. I studied at the University of Illinois. I got my bachelor's degree in biology and moved up to Chicago with absolutely no idea how I was going to make a living with a degree in biology. So I started bartending. And as a bartender in Chicago, and I worked at a saloon. It wasn't a restaurant. It was a place that restaurant people would come in and enjoy cocktails when they got off. And I became friends with a lot of these restaurant people around the great city of Chicago as a restaurant community, and started gaining an appreciation for food and wine, started seeing the connection with the science that I had studied as an undergrad, and also ultimately went to a music club where I was inspired by, worked as a bartender at a music club where I was inspired by the creative side of life that was very endemic in that bar. Musicians, artists, advertising people. This was the kind of place that drew those people in. I wanted to combine all those things, working in a restaurant, doing something creative and using that biology degree. And wine had become something that was part of my life. And I decided to take it the next step and make wine. And what I've learned and what has been one of the great rewards of my career is that combination of science, art, and that sounds very typical, and the interaction with the restaurant industry is nonstop in this great pursuit, and has got me to where I am today and kept me interested. And I work with incredible vineyards in the Napa Valley, and I work with great people that help me to create these great wines. And today we're going to learn about that. But before we do that, I think you ought to hear how Greg came upon this. So Greg, how did you get here?
Thanks, Chris. I thank you all again for joining us. This is awesome. What an honor to be with all, these 3 others on the screen and all of you that are joining. Thank you so much for that time. So for myself, similar in some ways, I think, and that's part of the impetus for exploring the two of us together, and then, you know, through these wines, is our paths. There's similarities to what we've committed to, and then there are kind of divergent elements here and there. But I think there's more similarities than not, which is the fun part. So for me, I grew up in Los Angeles. I didn't even know seasons really existed, to be honest. Like latchkey kid in the '70s, like many. And my first pursuit was French. So I went to UC Santa Barbara, lived in France for a little bit. And then I started off as a French instructor at UCSB while working on a master's that I never finished in French Lit. And all I wanted to do was teach. I love teaching so much. I love staff trainings. I love distributor things. I love things like this. But teaching and actually French Lit research as a 21-year-old living in a fraternity house on the beach in Isla Vista was not grad student material, as it turns out. So I was on academic probation. I was like the star teacher on academic probation, which for grad school doesn't really fly. That's not really the reason to do it. Anyway, I was doing that. I was stringing tennis rackets on the side, which I don't even play tennis, but I love monastic work. I love repetitive work. I'm a very simple person. And so I was doing that. And then I happened one day to open up an ad in the newspaper for a tasting room job at the Santa Barbara winery. I didn't even know Chardonnay was a grape, which was a stopgap as far as my first interview, as it turns out, which I didn't get the job the first time because I got stumped on that question. But I thought, oh, I can pronounce things, I can pull this off. But anyway, I got in, and one step into that winery, and I was just completely entranced by it all. And that was May of '91. I was 21. I got that tasting room gig. And for the past 30 years, I've worked on this one highway, Highway 246. And so that's my background. And then winery-wise, similar in some ways to Chris. I've been involved with different wineries in my past. Currently, it's 3 really here. It's Brewer-Clifton, and this will be our 25th harvest. This one upcoming super soon. Diatom that we'll touch on a little bit, which I started in 2005. And then there's a little Syrah project called Ex Post Facto, which was just a couple years ago. So that's me.
That's awesome. Did you end up doing any French Lit research?
No. I got shaken out. I got shaken out by like 11th century French. There's all these French students in the program with me, right? And they were getting spun out. And there's like really smart French students, like getting PhDs. And their job opportunities coming out of that were pretty slim. And I was like, if that's what you guys are shooting for, I'm gonna pull the ripcord now, because I'm like the bottom of this barrel. So no, I love teaching the undergrads. That was the best. But like once it got to grad student stuff, it was not my deal.
I love it. I love it. Well, I think we're going to move into some tasting. I'll highlight the tasting order. I always like to try to, and I would defer to the distinguished winemaker on the call, but if you have all of these wines open, feel free to kind of taste through them and not wait for us to guide you. Don't drink them all, so that when we do get to the specific wines, you can kind of get the insights that these guys are going to bring to the table. But you know, we're all cooped up at home. You might as well have some wine. It's happy hour somewhere, and it's certainly happy hour right here on the West Coast. So we have this lineup. To me, I'll just pontificate for a brief second. This lineup to me is really, really unique and really, really special. And I probably should have framed it a little bit better at the beginning, but Summit to See is what we're talking about, right? So, you know, Chris makes wines from high elevation in the Napa Valley and relatively high elevation in Australia. We're not going to talk about that today. And Greg makes wines from the rolling hills of the Santa Rita Hills AVA, and they're separated by a little bit of a geographical chunk. And the grape varieties, some interact, some don't. There's Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet Sauvignon. But I think one thing you'll see as we go through the wines is an amazing level of individuality in each of these gentlemen's wines. And I think it expresses the place that they come from, which is what wine is kind of all about, but it also expresses who they are. So we're going to get them to talk about that. So the first wine is the Diatom Catherine's Vineyard Chardonnay. And The second wine is the Brewer-Clifton 3D Chardonnay. The third wine is and I got in trouble, by the way, Carp, I got in trouble from everybody in the company because that is my favorite Chardonnay in our company, hands down, bar none. Sorry, everybody else.
Hey, TP,
can we
throw in Carp Chardonnay second, TP? Is that cool?
Well, no, but I would say this 3D is right there because so I didn't have a chance. The Key Chardonnay from Howell Mountain is a new look at brewers. Like, man,
I thought we talked about this.
In my Japanese philosophy.
My symmetry is blown. My parabola is blown.
The Keys really, Carp, blew my mind, and I just got to taste it for the first time about a month ago. So I'm excited about that wine. The Brewer-Clifton Machado Pinot Noir, which is from a very special site that Greg will talk about. La Jota Cabernet Franc, which is amazing stuff off of Howell Mountain, the vineyard we own and farm there, and then Mount Brave Cabernet Sauvignon to bring it home. So with that, I just wanted to kind of frame it and set the scene. Greg, tell us a little bit about Diatom and Catherine's and kind of what the ethos of that wine's all about.
Yeah, so for everybody too, I really, Chris and I and Tom, we do a lot of these, and I think what, our goal is really to kind of take you more like backstage and like what goes on in our heads and motivation and all that. So please, questions that come up or anything, and just, we want it to be super that for you instead of like, I don't know, more surfacey stuff. So, so please use the chat thing, do whatever. So Diatom is this. So Diatom, was really inspired by, I think when you work somewhere for a really long time, right? Like Chris has up there and I have down here, there's like a trust in the landscape and a confidence in the landscape. And it's almost like a significant other partner. You espouse yourself to a region and you can really be vulnerable with that region and really strip down with that region. And that's really what gave birth to Diatom for me, right? So a diatom is a plankton fossil that we have a lot of in our area. We have a mine of it actually a couple miles away. It's very beachy, it's skeletal, it's chalky, it's empty. And I wanted to explore an aesthetic that was demonstrative of that, albeit luxurious, right? So with some frequency in our business and any business really, I think when you work with epic raw materials, like whatever it is, like that unbelievable piece of produce or protein or whatever, there's frequently a tendency to embellish on that. It's like, oh my gosh, look how epic this is. I'm gonna roll up my sleeves and like, build upon it, which is a totally valid path. It's a beautiful path. This one was divergent for me. The thing here was I wanted something very solitary, very stripped away, very singular with luxury, right? So this is a stunning vineyard. It's 50 years old. It's been farmed beautifully by our company for all of those years, right up on the Tempest Gate bench, right adjacent to Cambria. So beautiful old vines. And I got to work with these vines in the late 70s for Brewer-Clifton, which is a little kind of inside baseball BC trivia. And I thought, wow, like self-rooted, gravelly soil, 50-year-old vines up in Santa Maria, like impeccably farmed. What would that look like through this aesthetic? Yeah, and what this is like Chardonnay raised in a very pent up way, right? It's like a wave before it breaks, or the feeling when you inhale before you exhale. That's really the premise here, but still something luxurious. I think a lot of times wines raised in a really tight linear way are beautiful, but they're light and they're snappy and they're crisp and refreshing. And, Hamptons, this, whatever, you pound them, you don't really think much about it. This wine is really not that. This is a massive Chardonnay. It's picked very, very ripe. And then it's raised just behind me in smaller versions of those, right? So stainless, cold, no mallow, early bottling. Yeah, so there's volume and horsepower and weight from the vine age and the fruit power. And then it's like an hourglass, like going from that bottom part of the hourglass, looking towards the restricted part. That's how the wine is interpreted, right? It's all about removal, polish, like just going that way. And that's the teeter-totter game with this wine, right? So it's big and weighty from fruit, and then it's kept propped up by the neurotic tight grip that holds the wine along its very short trajectory here. It's like from picking to bottling is like 4 or 5 months. It's like that.
That's awesome. I think it's delicious. I did make a slight mistake in the order, but I want to talk about the wine first. We'll go to the the Lokoya Keys Chard after this.
Right.
Greg, for me, I made a mistake, or I still printed stuff on paper, and I probably printed the wrong paper.
Oh, good.
I believe in phone books and chalkboards and erasers and stuff. It's kind of a depressing existence. But anyway, so I loved the things you said about this wine, the tension, right? It's got such, like, the fruit is very vibrant, but there's a tangible kind of element of minerality in this wine that I really love. And I don't always get that same level when I taste Cambria Catherine's Vineyard Chardonnay. I think maybe it's location in the vineyard. Obviously winemaking has a lot to do with it, but I just, there's a savory, bright, fresh component to this wine that I really like.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I do have actually a quick question for you, Greg. It's kind of a two-parter, but it's two different questions from two different people. So I think they kind of go together. The question is, in the beginning, is there, using a native yeast on this, and are there multiple clones, or is it just one?
Yeah, great question. So it's all the Chardonnay we do here is inoculated. There's one yeast I love called Morachet. It's old, it's funky, it's cheap, it foams over, it can be reductive. It's kind of a mess. And we've always used it here. So even if we didn't inoculate, I mean, probably even through the computer screen, I would set off your sourdough at home with the Morachet. So it's only that. I love yeast. Again, I'm not a scientist. I'm a French teacher, for goodness sake. So I love yeast is fun. Like, it smells cool. It gets all foamy in the bucket. And like, for that reason alone, I would use it. And then it's a single clone and single block. And that's a self-imposed rule for me for diatom, because a diatom is a singular plankton fossil. So it's like the Greg Brewer rule here, is that the wine has to emanate from a single provenance. Yeah, it's part of the thing.
So Greg, I love the wine speak, but I'm so over it. So I'm going to ask you a little more personal questions. The way you describe wine is there's a background to it. And I know that you're into a certain amount of Japanese philosophy. You were a French lit major, so Proust must have come into your world at some point along the way. How has that informed what you're doing with winemaking to create the wines that we're tasting from your repertoire tonight?
That's an awesome question. For me, these wineries, they're more reliant upon ritual than winemaking, the way people think about winemaking. And by that, what I mean is we do everything the same here. I mean, it's like, joking about the symmetry and things and the rules that are in this building, everything is carried out the same way every year. So I see myself more, not so much like, we don't really blend things. We don't kind of harmonize wines that way, which it makes more sense ultimately to do it that way. Here it's more like, I'm like the bald sushi chef, right? And I get on my bike in the morning and I go to the fish market and I know my purveyors and I throw the fish in the igloo behind me and I go to the restaurant and I do the exact same thing, the exact same way, 7 days a week, without even thinking about it. It all just becomes muscle memory. So I think that's kind of the Japanese part here. It's like ritual more than science or art, even in some ways. And I don't think I could pull that off in a lot of areas, right? I mean, if the weather were more challenging, I'd probably have to tack and whatever to kind of make the wines okay. But here, it's such an epic opportunity. In the 30 years I've been here, we've really never had bad fall weather. I mean, a couple of years there's like a little rain here and there, but really we can pick whenever we want. The fruit's there. And so it gives us the chance to be really vulnerable, really naked and pure.
Awesome. Well, hey, Chris, will you take us into the awesome Lokoya Keys Vineyard Chardonnay? My one comment to just frame how cool this is for everybody out there, whether they know it or not, is this is prime real estate on Howell Mountain, which means prime Cabernet Sauvignon country. And I love that you're making some Chardonnay off of the site. The wine blew my mind when I tasted it. Take it away. I think it's a really cool illustration of our commitment to making the best wine we can. You could probably make more money if you planted Cabernet Sauvignon in this exact same site. So I'll leave it at that and let you take over.
Right. So that was the basic reason for this wine, or the genesis of this wine, was that pragmatic discussion from a financial standpoint as to why we have a block of Chardonnay in what is Cabernet country. Now, Hall Mountain is one of the great mountain appellations in Napa Valley. It's due east of St. Helena for those that have been in Napa, and it is one of the great, one of the first appellations, and where a lot of the young cult wines came out of, or older cult wines, I should say. Randy Dunn family wines, Lokoya, which we now operate. There's a lot of great old wines being produced out of there, and ultimately became recognized as an appellation for Cab. We have this block of Chardonnay that had been making wines, but the wines that they were being produced for were not at a price point that could maintain that block as that particular variety. And whatever we say from a philosophical standpoint, from a winemaking geek, love the chemistry and the biology and all of those things, it's still a business. And so those decisions need to be talked about here and there. But so I look at it from two different ways. Not only do I make the wines for the brands that I mentioned, but I oversee, as a general manager of the vineyards here in Napa Valley. So I have to look at that from the pragmatic standpoint, but I also can divorce myself from that and think as a winemaker, which when you have an area that can produce the kind of grapes and has the right climate for a variety like Chardonnay that can elevate and bring a wine to the highest level, you want to preserve that. And you also want to preserve a bit of variability in these places, not everything being Cabernet. So we probably have one of the very last blocks of Chardonnay up there. And when we were in danger of having to pull it out for financial reasons, I raised my hand and I said, listen, I'll make a Chardonnay, I'll do it at the very highest level, and let's try to preserve this really killer, unique block up on Hall Mountain. So that's what I set out to do. And unlike Greg, who has had years of experience with Chardonnay, and is a master at it, I have never made a Chardonnay. And I was terrified. And I raised my hand to save that block, but ultimately didn't realize what I was getting myself into. I was very fortunate, or I am still very fortunate, to have many friends who are great Chardonnay winemakers. And some of them may be on the call here. I know one of my very good friends is on. Her name is Gillian Hanneman. Now, she's not a winemaker, but she's a compendium of wine knowledge. And she was the first person I turned to and said, I think I got myself into a little bit of a hole here. Can you help me? And she said, absolutely. Let's taste a lot of wine. And we've done that many times in the past, and we tasted through a lot of wines, she and I. And then I started picking the brains of some of my colleagues, Jeff Stewart from Hartford Court, Mike Sullivan from Bonovia, Michael Terrian, once his Cashmere Blaze of Obsidian, a number of great properties. He and I were schoolmates, and got a sense of what I wanted to do. And part of the philosophy that I pursue in winemaking, and this is where Greg and I have a very similar thought process, is wines have to speak to the place that you're making them from. If you put too much into the winemaking thought process from a technical or technological standpoint, you start changing the equation, moving more towards winemaking versus place. And I wanted to make a wine that really spoke to this really unique spot on Hall Mountain. And the wines that spoke to me more than any wines from a Chardonnay perspective that really had that expression were wines from France, from Chablis, and the understanding of these really individual vineyards and how they present themselves. And that's what I wanted to do. So this is how I pursued this particular wine. It's 22 months in oak, so very different than the diatom. And the oak is only a really sparingly small component to the texture and flavor of this wine. It's only about 7 to 8%, and they're aged in puncheons. They're these 135-gallon big vessels. It's been sur-lead, which means that the lees, or the dead yeast cells that have fallen to the bottom of the barrel, are stirred every once in a while, which helps to break those cells into smaller pieces, and those pieces get into the wine and create textural components. So a lot of the texture that you get from this wine is driven by this sur-lead process. And it was not allowed to go through malolactic. So malolactic, and we'll talk a little bit about this because I have some questions about Greg's malolactic process, is that portion of the fermentation that happens by a bacteria. And typically what it does is it changes the acid profile of the wine. But in Chardonnay, it also loads wines up with butter. As a butter, there's a compound that's created by it. And I didn't want that. Some people really dig that. God love all you Rombauer drinkers, but that's not what I was looking for. I wanted it to speak to that place. So the white pear, the peach, the minerality, that kind of almost sage-like character to this wine. I really wanted to preserve that. And so that little bit of oak, non-malolactic, that's what you're getting off of this wine. And it's been a great process. I've learned a tremendous amount by doing this. And, one of the things I have learned, again, I want to talk to Greg a little bit about this as we chat here, is Chardonnay is really a winemaker wine. It's a wine that you can move it in so many different directions. Cabernet is not such that in that case as great of a wine that way, but these wines are, and my winemaking sensibility around place really came into play with this, and hopefully proves itself out. So.
No, that the wine, one thing that really spoke to me having that wine over the course of several days when we had the first bottle, there was the purity of it was crazy. And for me, I picked up a really cool, like almost like tangerine skin, the sagey kind of brushy thing a little bit, but more, sorry, rough neighborhood, more the hot rod that didn't play. One thing that impressed me, that really struck me more was, like in the case was the center of gravity in the wine. I found like so beautiful and like in the middle, yeah, and like noble. You know what I mean? I think for us, our approach here is more like overshoot. You know what I mean? Like we pick kind of ripe, we kind of overdo it, and then like rein it back as best we can, right? And yours just was it was so much more it was so harmonious. And like right in the middle, if that makes sense. You know, it had like delicacy and presence and texture and length. And it was really, really, really stunning. I love that.
So part of that was that thought process going into, how I was going to do this. And one of the things that I was very keen on was not allowing the bacteria to present itself. And in one of the marketing pieces I got about your wines, Greg, there was something, and I didn't realize this. Let me quote this. And I love marketing pieces. It's for all you marketing people out there. We don't promote or prohibit malolactic fermentation. And then there's a little bit more. Now, when you do that, you can change the aspect of the wine. So how are you approaching that? I mean, with your wines?
So in the case of diatom, it's blocked, like severely blocked. So it ferments really, really, really cold right behind me. As soon as it goes dry, it's put to bed. Like it gets some SO2, we take the tanks to 30 degrees, stops, right? And that's, diatom needs that teeter to the totter, or the totter to the teeter, whatever. In the case of Brewer-Clifton, it's kind of self-regulating. The barrels aren't conducive to it. The alcohol kind of keeps it quiet because it's pretty high, typically. We're not stirring, the barrel room is pretty cool. And all of those circumstances kind of keep it really from transpiring. And we've never, the very first year, 96, it was, we never wanted to pump things. We wanted it all to go through mallow. And I remember, really beating up the wine and trying to get it to go through so that we could be gentle by not filtering. And then it was actually the 97 Catherines. It's really funny that we're talking about that wine. 97 Catherines, the acidity was really high, the alcohol was pretty high. And I was like stirring it and heating it and re-inoculating for mallow, heating two barrels, but like heating blankets and all that, so as to be gentle later. And I was like, you're such a hypocrite. I'm glad. I was pretty dumb in my 20s, but at least I had the foresight then, thinking, whoa, that's so hypocritical. Like you want to save a filtration step. So you're going to just, beat this wine up. And from that moment on, we're like, you know what, it's going to be what it's going to be. And then it's really become our style, just to rely on the malic, to keep it, and which gives us the opportunity to pick as ripe as we do. Because a lot
have
of
you ever had a year where it's just become like the malic has done really well versus another year that it doesn't go that way? And
we never really check. We never check. It all just works
Got a
out.
steady state in your winery then. pretty
Yeah,
much.
exactly.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I guess we should move to the next wine. For any other questions about La Jota? No. Okay, good.
This is awesome, you guys. Thank you. I will just interject briefly. I love talking about wines and listening to winemakers talk about wines. I apologies to any master sommeliers that are on the call, but I am very bored with tasting with master sommeliers because I don't really learn anything. But I always love one of the point I was trying to highlight is both of these gentlemen talked about texture and weight and how the wine actually feels in your mouth as opposed to lemon, apple, onion skin, whatever kind of term. To me, texture is like, it makes wine really real. And it's one of the things I love that every winemaker I get a chance to, I'm fortunate enough to talk to about, really is a central part of their focus and the way they kind of approach things. So, Mr. Brewer, would you talk please about the 2017 Brewer-Clifton 3D Chardonnay, sir?
Sure. And I'm also stoked that we're not talking about onion skin, Thomas Price. I'm glad that's not penetrating.
No, we're not going to say it's not going to happen.
That would be
tonight.
awesome. Yeah, so 3D is next. So 3D is a vineyard that we planted in 2007. So 2007 for us was really a turning point. You know, we started Brewer-Clifton with $12,000 back in '96. And then we worked hard and we got creative and we figured it out along the way. And then, we got some media attention in the early 2000s, and that helped to kind of get us up, a little bit bigger. And we started a farming team in 2005. And then during that time in the neighborhood, it was very hot and bothered. Sideways just dropped. Everyone was planting Pinot. And we've always been kind of equal parts, Chardonnay and Pinot. And no one was planting it. We're like, we'll pay by the acre. We'll pay whatever you want. Like, we need Chardonnay. We want Chardonnay. And a lot of growers were like, no, I'm just going to do Pinot. It's not about Chardonnay. And I was like, oh. And actually, a funny story about that it was when Barbara and Tigner and Jeff came down to talk to us about the kind of, joining forces with Jackson family. They were all upstairs. It was so funny. And they asked about the breakdown of Chardonnay and Pinot. And I looking at Barbara in the eye, and I was like, oh, I've always been really bullish on Chardonnay. It was so funny. And I was like, Greg, you're such a loser. And as soon as I said that, I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm like nervous. And I said the dumbest thing, like to you all, like, here I am all badass, like with my 1,000 cases of Chardonnay. It was pretty funny. Anyway, so we needed Chardonnay. And so I got a cold call one day from a gentleman who has this vineyard or ag land, which is right next door to Santa Barbara Wineries vineyard, which is where I was trained, right? And so he just cold called me for no reason, and then about real estate or something. And I drove by his place on the way home because we were looking to lease land. We couldn't afford to buy land, but we wanted to lease land and plant a vineyard. And so drove by, checked it out, and I met with them, husband and wife. And it was really funny. And so we're talking, and they're like, oh, so what are you going to plant? Pinot and Syrah? And I was like, oh, no, we're going to do it all in Chardonnay. And their faces dropped. And I was like, uh-oh, Brewer, like backpedal. I was like, and I go, unless that's a deal breaker. And I said, we're leasing the land. In my head, I'm thinking, we're leasing the land. Like, we could plant pumpkins if we wanted. And so we made a compromise. They leased us another 3 acres. We threw in some Pinot, but really this ranch was for Chardonnay, and it was going to be exclusively Chardonnay. And then when
How many pumpkins did you plant?
That's a secret. Yeah, I'll send you one in October. And so anyway, so we planted 5 clones of Chardonnay in equal parts, and it's like a gentle sandy thing. And it doesn't look that dramatic. It's just cool, right? So it's like light sand on top. And we planted the 5 clones. I mirrored like the body of an animal. I think Chris and I are inspired by a lot of different things. He is with, nature. I want to kind of go there with him later. Music, different things. And I'm the same. And I was reflective of like being at the fish market in Japan. It could almost be any animal, but watching ahi tuna being butchered is fascinating, right? And you see in that moment, the delineation of flesh, right? The akami, the chutoro, the otoro going down towards the belly. And in that moment with that sword, like the values determined, the destinations determined. And so we planted 5 clones with that same spirit, right? So we put kind of leaner clones on top of the vineyard. And then the 2 bottom blocks, about 1.5 acres each, is for me the Chutoro and the Otoro. It's the most kind of oily, fatty, greasy clones of Chardonnay that I'd worked with around here. One is Wente from the original Nielsen vineyard. We got via Sea Smoke. And then the other is Mount Eden. And so they're in equal parts all the time. So it comes in, you know, picked relatively ripe, comes in here, gravity behind me in the tanks, gravity down to about 15 to 25-year-old barrels. And that's it. No lee stirring. Again, mallow, you know, doesn't really happen. About 14, 15 months, and then it comes up, gets cleaned up and bottled. So that's it. It's kind of, you know, Santa Rita for me is very kind of lemon, lime, salt. And then with this kind of additional, for me, kind of greasy, sultry element that the darker sand gives and those 2 clones give.
I love, go ahead, Carp, sorry.
When you're bringing those in, Greg, I may have missed this. Are you bringing all the clones in together?
No, it's all separate.
So, when you're blending them, you're blending them based on those lots that are clonal in origin, yeah?
Right. Yeah, but they're predetermined. Like when we planted those 2 sections, their fate was determined. Like they were going to be this wine in equal parts, right? So it's not. There's never. So we know, you know. Again, we raise everything the same here, right? But nothing's, you know, that's the predetermination. And that's the weird ritual part about what happens here. So, you know, it comes in, we know what it is, but, you know, it goes up, it goes down to 20-year-old wood, and then that's it. You know, it's really, and then when we go to bottle, you know, there's, you know, I won't say excess, but there's additional volume of those 2 blocks that go into the Santa Rita Hills wine. And so our blending is really just a volume game, right? So let's just say, oh, we're going to make 200 cases of this. I'll get, you know, white duct tape out and just, you know, mark 4 barrels of that clone, 4 barrels of that clone, and that's it. And it's always that way.
That's interesting. I mean, that must, in different years, you'd imagine that different clones are going to perform differently. And then by way of keeping that consistent, you're probably seeing how those clones then dry, I'm guessing, because I've not tasted a lot of these wines side by side, but maybe how those clones, each particular vintage, one is driving versus the other, you know, and that defines that vintage.
Exactly.
Cool.
That's kind of the premise of it.
All right.
Yes, it's not about making the wine good even necessarily. I mean, it's just about kind of adhering to that.
This is not a good wine, by the way. I was just going to say that, you know, come on. It's not about making the wine good. It's not a good wine.
You know what, and I think in the interest of progressing from a tannin kind of standpoint, we're going to talk about the Machado Pinot Noir next, but I wanted to ask Greg really, really quick. There is, and I mean this in the most positive way, and you talk about the wines this way, I do too. There is such a beautiful salty savoriness to the wines from Santa Rita kind of in general, but I think Brewer-Clifton specifically, I always get like such a, and I know you've talked about, you know, the deconstructed margarita, right? Lime, lemon, salt. Is that driven by soil or winemaking or a little of everything? If you could just expound on that for a second.
Oh yeah, sure. It's everything. Yeah, you can't segregate what things are. And you know, it's this landscape. It's what it does. So you know, the ocean's right here. It's cold. The soils are sand and plankton and whatever else we have here. All of that. And I think it's the saline vibe, right? There's something very kind of savage and serene about an ocean, right? Kind of like mountains. And that was really the premise of this study. And wines are very kind of extreme in their own way. And I think, you know, that it's just harnessing that and transmitting that. And we have it in spades. And I think, you know, there aren't distractive elements in this wine, right? And I don't mean, in distracting, I don't mean bad, right? So even the way Carp was referencing lactic acid, right? So he, you know, his intent there was to preclude that because he didn't want that to cloud the voice of that site, right? So similarly, in our case, you know, part of the neutrality behind me is, you know, being frugal and being like a latchkey welfare kid growing up, right? But then also it's not wanting anything to kind of cloud the voice of the wine, right? Like lactic wood or whatever. And so I think there's an opportunity for that saline, crystalline, salty, whatever that feeling is in the mouth is more prominent because all the other levers on the mixing board are dropped down. So that one can be louder. Yeah.
I love it. That's a great explanation. All right. Should we taste some Pinot Noir?
Let's do it.
Before we do that, before we get to red, Greg, my apologies. A really, really good question. This is kind of the theory of getting into the wine business. And it's really for all three gentlemen here. How would you encourage a younger wine colleague just to pay attention to and be aware as they're entering a wine profession, whether it's in sales or whether it's in winemaking or in education? It's a good question. I thought that would be a kind of a good segue to red.
Wow. I'll go first on that if you guys don't mind. I mean, I think that the ultimate sort of, and I love the fact that hospitality was inserted into that question and connection with consumers. I've always been a drink what you like guy, man. And if I came up in steakhouses and I've probably served more Brunello di Montalcino and Silver Oak Cabernet with oysters than any man alive. Do I recommend that as a wine and food pairing? No. However, the guests that I served loved it and felt good about drinking wine, and it opened their mind to more diverse wines as they move down their path. And I think that's really all I have to say about that. I think it's encourage people to drink what you like, even if you personally might not agree with it. That's my sommelier's sort of viewpoint, but I'd love to hear what the gentlemen have to say about it.
Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I can't speak to the other professions in the winery world, but what I can speak to is winemaking. And what I would say from a winemaking perspective, you want to make great wine, pay attention to the vineyard and make sure that you learn what it takes and where it takes to make great wines from a vineyard perspective. And then always keep in mind, and I beat this into my interns every year, is that we get to do a really cool thing. We get to live in a really cool world of people, of places, of experiences, and that's a great privilege. But in order to do that, we got to pay the bills, and it's still a business. And don't ever forget that, because be driven by the creative side, be driven by quality, but remember that it's still a business and we still got to pay the bills, and that will help you understand when decisions are made that you're like, where is that coming from? And it'll help you also present from a winemaking standpoint the reasons that we want to do something that seems a little crazy right now, but trust me, it's going to pay the bills later. That needs to be thought out, and that'd be my advice.
Yeah, and then I'll lastly for me, from this question, gentlemen, by the way, was from my beautiful journalist wife. That's why it's so thorough and involved. Thanks, Sonia. So for me, just be nice to people and be inclusive of people. I think sometimes, young people in any career path, there's a tendency to like prove something or, that. And sometimes that unfortunately, and sometimes not deliberately, can be at the expense of kind of, lessening other people's approaches. And I think just being cool and being inclusive and, and being true to your thing. And that's something that I've always revered about, Chris as a person and craftsperson, artist, winemaker, is like, he's very true to Chris Carpenter and the mountains and Napa and that style, and I think that's the goal, right? Is to be true to yourself, be true to your brand, be true to your kind of motivation, and to adhere to that, and just to be cautious, even in word choice and presenting that wine and being prideful of that choice, not to kind of, throw other people under the bus in so doing. So that would be my advice to someone younger.
That's absolutely terrific. There is a part two. I'm not trying to hijack Ryan's thing, but I think you just actually, it was Sonia again, by the way, GB. so she asked, what do you wish your colleagues would have told you when you entered the industry that you had to discover the hard way? And I think that you just really kind of encapsulated and touched on that. It's like, be cool, man. If everyone get over being the smartest person in the room and be the most hospitable and inclusive person in the room, and try to encourage people's passion and intensity for what they like, even if you don't like it yourself. That's, I think you actually covered it beautifully in that comment.
Yeah, cool. I mean, that's really it. I mean, wine freaks people out, right? I mean, wine's intimidating. If between the three of us alone on this call, right? How many times have we fielded a question where the word should was embedded within it, right? When should I drink this? What should I eat with it? What glassware should I, who should I, when should I, what temperature should I, should. So people are fearful, they're looking for permission, right? And so, if they're learning about wines from different areas, and if they're hearing little sound bites that are potentially misunderstood, it can really go south. Right?
Yeah.
And so just everyone is mindful and cool, then it helps to prevent that.
Love it. All right.
So Pinot Noir here. So Machado is kind of the sibling vineyard to 3D. So Machado we planted in 08. Times were good for us then. Like between 00 and 08, we were jamming and very confident, and stainless steel walls and crazy stuff that I wouldn't do now. But it was a very confident time in culture, I think. And so that's when we were planting. And so 3D was 07, this was 08. And the Machado family is a beautiful family. So here too, when you put your name on a label, it's one thing, it's fine. If the wine's lame, you just have, yourself to blame. It's not a big deal. When you put like another person's family's name on a label, like an old farming family locally, the Machado family, it's a big deal. It's a huge honor, and it's a privilege, and it's a responsibility, I think. And so that's kind of the thing here. This, just like the 3D, it's one part of this vineyard. And when we planted this one little knoll, we knew that would become the Machado bottling. So it's 2 clones. The main thing here is whole cluster, right? So Brewer-Clifton has always been a predominant whole cluster house for Pinot. So normally with wines, most wines, the stems are removed, right? And they're, the stems are, worked back in the vineyard or whatever. This they're fermented in their entirety. Yeah, so it's kind of like cooking a protein with a skeleton, like a chicken breast on the rib, a bone and piece of meat, a whole fish. So the proportion has to work. And the reason for doing that is multifold. Here, the Santa Rita fruit can be very lush and round and sensual and curvy and beautiful, and probably an easier sell than this aesthetic, to be honest. But what the stems do for us is it's like a corset around that beautiful curvature of the body. It just tends to, instead of being quite so obvious, it's more suggestive, a little more coy in some ways. And then there's a spicy element in the nose, I think. And then the tannin source here is predominantly stem tannin. Yeah, it's like 80 or 90% whole cluster fermented. And so that drying tea-like savory soy vibe that substantiates this wine architecturally is a result of the stem's participation in the system. Because again, it's aged in barrels that are 15 to 25 years old, and not racked, nothing for 14, 15 months. And then it just gets put back together and bottled.
How does the combination of the ripeness of the fruit and the keys that you're looking for on the stem, like lignification or something along those lines, how do those come into play when you're making that picking call? Because you go a little bit too early, and those stems are going to drive a different character on the tannin.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's happening a lot down here these days. Actually, it's interesting. Like we talked about this a little bit going into this call about how there's kind of like stylistic pendulum swings sometimes. I think in any business, be it neckties, music, fashion, art, wine, for sure. And I think there's a study of Pinot Noir done by a lot of colleagues now down here, where they're picking earlier and relying on stems, and it can work for sure. I mean, again, everything's possible. It's a different result, right? So Pinot down here early with stems is more like snappy, crunchy pomegranate, Bing cherry, and like a more resinous pine kind of aesthetic woven through that. It's more holiday spice, you know? And for us, it's more like, again, for the corset, for me, you need curves, you know what I mean? And if you put a corset on something too skeletal, it doesn't make any sense. And so for us, it's like ripe fruit. It's 2 clones that are very generous. One's called 459, we got from Sea Smoke. They got it from the Jura somewhere. And then clone 37 from Mary Edwards. And both of those clones, they're very bespoke for stem inclusion. And they hold them well, but it's late season stuff. I mean, this is like the salty dogs on their boat, late season fishing, you know, like this is cable knit sweaters and clam chowder and yellow slicker kind of stuff as far as the time of year, because for us anyway, you need that curvy volume to be able to like prop it up with the stems.
And Greg and Chris, there's a question. And by the way, it's chowder. Chowder. Anyway, we got some Boston people here, so I needed to translate there. But a great question. You actually nailed the tanning question before I could even get to it. But I think all in all, when you do make Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, or just wine in general, what makes you decide like stainless steel or just this much oak or this particular barrels? I think that's a pretty darn good question.
Yeah, I'll direct it to Chris because we don't really make choices the way, you know. You want to take that one, Carp?
Yeah, well, a lot of it comes with experience, you know, and understanding interactions with particular varieties in particular places and how they express themselves and how that's going to match with whatever vessel you put them in. A lot of it's through experimentation. I just, my colleague, Jota Kelly, who makes gallery wines, is running a lot of Cooper trials in her 19 vintage, and she and I just went through them today, in fact. And it's one of the great fun aspects of winemaking is trying to figure out how each one of these coopers and how each barrel expresses itself relative to the wine that you're putting on them. And so those experiments are key to determining future decisions. You know, and I think about my early years in Australia in 12 and 13, when I was taking a lot of my sensibility about wines here in California and applying it to a place that I was still learning about. And any winemaker who tells you they can go into a new place and know it immediately is smoking something other than cigars. And you know, the reality is it took me a couple of years to finally dial that oak imprint on the Higginbotham wines in the McLaren Bill, because it is very different than here. I had the base knowledge of what Cabernet does and how Cabernet, as it's developing in a fermenter, might interact, but I've still modified that over time. So it's not something that you do immediately either. It's something that there's an evolution, and there's a lot of reference to history that you've created over the years. And so again, as winemakers, if you're going that way, always do Cooper trials, always experiment. It's a really fun aspect of the job, and you learn a tremendous amount. Greg, I have a question. So you've been doing Brewer-Clifton for a really long time. I mean, I met you way back when we were laying at the pool at Kapalua some years ago, and you were this hot new brand out of Santa Barbara, and your wines have been really consistent over the years, which is part of your kind of approach to them. But your philosophies and who you are have evolved a lot, and I think moving from French to lit, what that can change your mind into ways of thinking, into these Japanese philosophies that you're into. How have you reflected on those wines over that amount of time, given that kind of thought process? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I think I've been thinking about it a lot. I think in particular in the past 6 or 8 months, you know, we've all had, you know, kind of more time to think about stuff. And for me, it's about like surrendering to something. You know, I think about why we do what we do, and it's, you know, it's kind of like this removal. It's like removal of circumstance and succumbing to something, right? It's still maintaining confidence, but it's like this surrender to the landscape. And I think that's been the refinement, I think, for me. And you know, part of that is, you know, the neutrality piece is part of that kind of journey. You know, the diatom thing, you know, not really blending the way we do. It's all, that's been the evolution, you know. So in a lot of ways, things haven't changed at all, but there has certainly been refinement. You know, it's like evolution, not revolution. That's kind of
yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it.
Awesome.
So we move on?
Yeah.
let's taste some Lokoya Cabernet Franc. I do have a quick anecdotal story, Carp, before you roll on this wine. So I was at Texom at the wine awards, not the actual event, and I'm sitting at a table with a bunch of heavy hitters. Fred Dame was at the table, and
Fred.
Blah blah blah. Yeah, we're tasting California Cabernet based wines, and the Cabernet Franc category comes out, and there's probably 8 of them. And I'm going through, and we are doing this on the full single blind, right? We know the grape variety, but we have no idea the producer or anything. And out of the 8, I was like, I guarantee this is Lokoya Cabernet Franc. It was all of our favorites. I'm not just trying to shine you. It's true. And I looked the next day because they give the sheets out the next day. And so I blinded it out of 8 to what it was. And it was pretty cool. And everybody, they kind of called me a homer too, but I was like, hey man, the wine was showing beautifully. And I picked it out of a lineup. So that's all I got for you. Take it away. The wine is delicious.
We've talked a lot about tradition in this tasting, and that is a tradition that was started by the previous owner of Lokoya when he planted these old vines in '76, and we're still farming that particular block of Cabernet Franc. He was a guy named Bill Smith. He was the person who rebooted Lokoya after it had gone out of business post Prohibition, and one of the things that he did, which was unusual, was he chose St. George to plant this Cabernet Franc block on. And St. George is a rootstock that was popular prior to that time. Mostly a lot of the old vine Zin that we have up here, the Charbonneau, is on St. George. But during that time, most people were planting Bordeaux varieties to AXR, which is ultimately the rootstock that failed and created the big disaster that we all had to deal with in the 90s. So when we acquired this winery in 2005, the Cab Franc had been made continuously since the first vintage, I think was in '82. And this vineyard is still there. In fact, I was up there 2 days ago with one of the buyers for Whole Foods, and they wanted to see the winery. I'm like, no, we've got to go pay homage to one of the oldest Cab Franc blocks in Napa Valley. And so I took them in there, and we all did this, and it was great. But it's a fabulous vineyard, and Cab Franc is an incredible variety, and a variety that has as much history, as much complexity, as interest, ageability as Cabernet Sauvignon. It's one of those that has kind of been in the shadows of Cabernet Sauvignon, along with Merlot to a certain degree. And, I'm all about the underdog, and I really wanted to promote what Cabernet Franc could be. And growing it in a place like the mountains, where you get this tremendous amount of minerality, you've got a red fruit meets black fruit character, an herbalness that is more rosemary-ish than anything else, and a tannin that's different than Cabernet Sauvignon, but clearly a mountain kind of backbone. This is a great project to jump into, and because of this, I've like gone crazy with Cab Franc. I make a Cab Franc from Mount Brave. I make a Cab Franc in Australia, and we now have a new wine that's a multi-appellation Cab Franc in the same vein as like a Cheval Blanc kind of wine called Caledon that we're really excited to turn people onto. That's a little bit about the Cab Franc.
So I'd love to follow up on something you said that it was actually going to be a question that I wanted to pose to you anyway about Cab Franc. I've always loved it, and the great heralded examples and the more kind of main simpler ones, whatever. And I've loved it, but I question myself because I also love I love being an assistant winemaker. I'd love to be like the vice principal. I love that underdog spirit. And so when you said that, it really spoke to me. Do you think that because of both of our backgrounds, think that's part of it? Because not to be like, if we were a grape, like a spirit. Yeah. I'm not trying to be cheesy, but you know what I mean? Like, because we both are kind of Cab Franc-esque in some way. Would you agree or not?
Yeah, well, I think part of the reason I've always been for the underdog is because in many cases I've been the underdog personally, and I like to, as we all do, you like to have success, and that you can only be the underdog for so long until you want to start winning, and Cab Franc is one of those varieties that I think it's as good as Cabernet Sauvignon. I think Merlot is as good as Cabernet Sauvignon. Just as, when I was an athlete, I was as good as the guy down the way, but I had to prove it, and I still have a little bit of that sensibility about me. And when you have varieties that really can speak to that quality level at the same level, you want to turn people onto it, and that's the other part of it. I really enjoy seeing people. Like, I took that group of people into the cellar, into the tunnels that we have at Lokoya after we were in the vineyard, and I tasted them particularly on one of the great Merlots I have in my inventory, and on the Cab Franc from the previous vintage, and to see their faces and have joy, and then also be examining why that joy is a little bit different than the Cabernet Sauvignon joy was incredible. I'm sure you do that. And one of the things I want to pay homage to the young lady who's been sending us questions, Sonia, because, by the way, she kicks Greg's ass in winemaking. The grenaches that this woman makes are off the charts. And, Greg, I'm sure you enjoy Pinot Noir, but drinking her grenaches is probably a treat as well, and at the same level, right?
For sure.
Anyway.
Thanks for that shout out.
And Chris, I think there was a great little point, and I definitely see that in our tasting room. But Cabernet Franc has definitely become very sought after in the last 5 years or so. Do I have some opinions on why, but do you think do you have an opinion on why that may be?
I've contemplated that for a little bit, and I think a lot of the new generation of wine drinkers, the one that we're so worried about, is also an opportunity because they're wanting to explore new things, and they are also of an age now, and I'm speaking of the millennials, where they're starting to understand where quality and consistency reside versus the new thing just because it's the new thing. It can be the new thing and have quality, right? And what we're seeing is that new focus. Merlot, I think, is shedding the after effects finally of what Sideways did for the wine industry. Greg and the folks in the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay world really benefited from Sideways, whereas those creating Merlots had a number of years of pain, but that's kind of going away, and people are coming back to it. So I think there's just a little bit more openness. I hope there's a little bit more openness, and there's also the way that information is getting put out there now. There's so much more ability to tap into a larger pool of information. People are able to learn about things a little bit earlier than if they stumble on an article in an old school magazine about Cab Franc. There might be a half a dozen things on Cab Franc that's just a click away. So I think that all has a combination that helps this.
I love it. That is, I would say, Carp, my observations of the younger wine drinker completely fall in line with that. People are more adventurous. They're more, there's so much more information at their fingertips, and they don't want to. My colleague with Jackson Family, Nick Hetzel, says he does a great presentation on Australia, and he talks about going down there, which you're obviously very familiar with. People don't want to drink what their parents necessarily drink, right? And I think that there's a group of drinkers that are casting a much wider net in terms of flavors and grape varieties and winemaking styles, and I think it's nothing but good for business in the industry. It's really cool. Would you mind, Mr. Carpenter, taking us through the lovely Mount Brave Cabernet Sauvignon?
Yeah, so the last wine is Mount Brave. Mount Brave is a really special place in my heart because it was the very last brand and wine that our founder created. And he did that personally with me over a long meeting and brought myself and my wife and our old general manager into a room and said, I want you to create a wine from Mount Veeder. I want it to be from this new vineyard that I acquired, and I want it to really express what Mount Veeder can do. And we had acquired the Chateau Patel vineyard about 2 years earlier. And that vineyard proved to be a little bit different than the Veeder Peak vineyard, which are contiguous one another on Mount Veeder, which is on the southern part of Napa Valley. Our vineyard is due west of Oakville. And, you know, it was that moment with Justin and him getting to see that go to fruition before he passed, and that being the last thing, and he asking me to do that was, again, something that I keep in mind all the time. One of the things that I do with this wine, because of that, is I concentrate, rather than blending across a number of different appellations, which I do with Cardinale, this is purely about the Mount Veeder appellation. And because I do like to blend, and my blending is different than Greg's, whereas Greg is, depending on the nuance that's coming from that consistency each year, and we spoke about that earlier, which I think it's really a cool concept. My blending is about finding balance points between the different varieties, and this wine has 5 different varieties. It's a typical Bordeaux blend: 87% Cabernet, 6% Cab Franc, 4 Merlot, and then 2 each of Malbec and Petit Verdot. And you know, we talk about Greg's philosophies around Japanese culture and the philosophies that have been developed there. And again, I got to think that if he studied French lit, he's got a little bit of that background as well. Mine is really driven by music and how music informs my zeitgeist, my mood, and the way I think about flavor. And flavor being highs, lows, it has dynamics, it has flow, it has emotion, it has everything that you think about with music, right? And music, because it's such an important part of me, when I'm thinking about blending things, I'm thinking, okay, what part of this is the bass line? What part is the let's say the violin section in an orchestra? What part is the brass? And how do they all fit? And how do they balance so that when you taste this wine, it's a complete wine? It does everything that music does to you, right? Sparks your emotions. It gets you. It brings you to a new place. It creates memories, and it does it in a way that is fulfilling rather than contentious, if you will, right? You know, if you are listening to a great orchestra and they're playing Mozart and they're doing fabulous, and all the different sections are working really well, and then suddenly the brass goes off on a ragtime jazz thing in the middle of that, you're going to remember that, but you're not going to remember it in a positive way. You're going to be like, what the hell is that? Especially if you're really looking forward to a little knock music. You know, that's how I think about blending, and that's what Mount Brave Cabernet is about. Mount Brave Cabernet is also about an approachability. I make another wine called Lokoya. Lokoya is a study of these 4 mountaintops that we have in Napa Valley from 4 different appellations. And the Veeder wine is a massive, structural, ageable, awesome wine. But a lot of times you can't get at it really early in its lifetime. And there's so many great things to discover about Veeder that I wanted to bring to the table with Mount Brave. So the addition of those other varieties, softer speaking blocks, that's what creates Mount Brave. We also make, just as an FYI, we make a 100% Malbec, another Cab Franc, and a Merlot off of the same vineyard. And it's an incredible spot on Mount Veeder.
Can I jump in with a question I've been dying to ask you? And it goes back to the music part and like Cabernet and that kind of like pressure up in Napa. So, you know, you've been, you know, rightly associated with like perfect wine, you know, 100-point wines, and there's that kind of expectation. And awareness in the public's eye and everything else. And so when you're in that headspace, right, you're listening to the music that you're vibing on, you're by yourself, you're doing your blends, when you're creating that score, if you will, are you like seeking that, and or are you also like availing yourself to elements that are a teeny bit off kilter? Not the distractive thing like you mentioned, but like a little note, a little bit out of tune. You follow me? Like to maintain that intrigue, as opposed to like perfection, quote unquote.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, you could look at any kind of music. I mean, jazz, you think about jazz is all about what you're describing there, right? But there's a, underlying that is a perfection, right? So that what brings to the table the a little bit of uncomfortableness with what you're trying to describe is the fact that that's meant to be there to a certain degree, and because it's meant to be there, there's a perfection to that, right? You know, I think with my wines, what I'm really looking for that you know, emotional output, and what I look for as I was driving around today. I was in vineyards all morning, and I was listening to the Allman Brothers, one of my favorite bands, and I had it on shuffle, and Blue Sky came on, which is just one of the most awesome songs, especially when you're driving around in Napa Valley, and it's as beautiful as it was today. And there's a perfection in that song, you know. But I know a lot of the guys in that band had flaws, right? Dickie Betts wasn't the most kind guy, and Greg Allman had his ups and downs. But they still were able to create beauty together, and that's kind of how I think about it. And how the wines ultimately turn out is it's an expression of me and all the baggage that I come with, and all of the challenges that it took to bring those wines to where they were, and then bring them together and try to make them good. If that makes sense or not, I don't know.
It totally does. No, it totally does. That's something that, you know, it's beautiful. I think we have more leeway here. I think so anyway. You know, Chard and Pinot, if they're a little quirky, they're a little off kilter, I don't know. I think we have a bit more leeway. And I think, you know, and I was just thinking about, if I were up there, I just think like that, you know, that pressure, I guess, is kind of the word, and expectation. And especially because like you know, you're driving, you know what I mean? Like you're putting the blend together, it's your farming, you're managing the vineyard. I mean, you're completely in control, and how much you're willing and desirous to kind of like, again, like tweak, you know, just a little bit. And I love you were so careful with your word choice, and it was so beautifully shared. I won't forget it. It was awesome. But like, if it was meant to be there, then it's perfect, right? So it's you know, it's a kind of wabi-sabi Japanese thing where, you know, you're neurotic and you're raking your garden, or you're raking your rock garden, whatever. But like, you know, you see that one last leaf that's there, but you deliberately let it be there. And that's when the garden's perfect, right? And so that the intent behind that element is really the key, I think, that you said so eloquently. That was beautiful. Thank you. Cool.
It's awesome stuff, guys. I mean, I feel like I know what goes into margarita. You guys are getting spiritual. This is phenomenal. I really like it. I think I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I think we're doing fine. Are we okay, Ryan? I have one question that I want to ask Carp about Viter, and he alluded to ageability of wines off of especially our site, but that AVA in general. What is it about the Viter tannins, man? They're different than everywhere in the valley to me. I mean, to me, Howell has a little more kind of intense attack. Spring Viter to me has this velvety integrity. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and I don't want to geek out too much and talk tannins, but Viter tannins to me are really unique and special. That's what I'd say.
And they're probably, for me, the chewiest of the tans. They're the ones
Yeah,
that
okay.
I could just eat those tans. Well, it's common, as you can imagine, it's a combination of things. It's not only the soils, and we deal with up in Vita, it's a combination of sedimentary soils and volcanic soils, but it's the position of our vineyard, and it's how air movement and the diurnal shift that we get to enjoy on these mountain sides changes how tannins develop during the ripening process. Tannins, ripening happens on two different levels. It happens with sunlight, which changes most of the phenolic characters, a good portion of the phenolic characters, and heat. And heat's driving the rise in sugars, the drop in acidity, and the drop in tannin. What happens at Vita is we'll start in the evening. The first place that all that cold air that rolls in off of the bay hits, and air moves at higher elevations and ultimately falls to lower elevations. That air hits Vita first, and it cools Vita down at probably, right now, what is it, 5? So the cold air has been flowing in probably for about an hour now. I don't know what it's going to do with this high pressure point, but typically around 3-ish, that air will start moving in. By 7, 8 o'clock, it's a lot cooler up in Vita than down on the valley floor. So those processes that create those tannins stop. They don't continue like they would up in Calistoga, where it's 104 still, where those tannins are still developing, and you'll wash out a lot of those tannins. So you get that, it's almost like locking that in. And then what happens in the evening is all that cold air that's started in the mountains drops to the valley floor, and it gets to be a little warmer up there. And so in the morning, you'll get a little bit of that tannin evolution, but not too much until the sun is out and you get it going again. And so that balance point and that what the soil is doing creates those tannins that are so indicative of Vita. And a lot of how I separate the 4 mountaintops here in Napa, Diamond Spring, Holland, Vita, that we work with, is by way of their tannin expression. You're up in Calistoga near Diamond, those tannins are a lot softer,
Exactly.
and they express themselves in that way.
Yeah.
Then you're over in Halmar, where the soils are just really ground with a lot of iron, and you get this cold air that moves across that mountaintop, and it changes the way those tannins evolve, and they create more of this gravelly tannin. And then in spring, you get this really fine, like angular thing that you have to learn to spread out a little bit, but they're so like sweet and yummy. They're different than the Vita tannins, but they're unique and still part of that mountain expression.
That's phenomenal.
Chris, I have one quick question to go with that with the Vita, and then I have a pretty deep question for both you and Greg. To go with the Vita, pretty interesting question here. On that Vita thought is, if a vineyard is on the east side of Moon Mountain, would it express more like Mount Vita?
Oh, wow. The only wine that I've had consistently from over there is Cayman. And what's interesting, and I don't know exactly where Cayman is, but there is a consistency there. They're still, it's not getting the same kind of sunlight being on the eastern side, but it is still benefiting from that cold air rolling in. I mean, it's just on the other side of the hill, and it's still being affected by a lot of the same things that we are over here. It's not like the Russian River, which is more driven by what's going on off of the ocean. It is more bay-driven air movement. So yeah, I think again, I haven't had a lot of wines from that side of the hill, except for that Cayman. That Cayman had that blue fruit, it had that violet, it had that tannin expression that our wines have.
And he made all of his money writing Karate Kid, by the way, just in case you didn't know that, Robert Kamen. So it was Karate Kid money. So Greg, I want so Greg, this is definitely a question for both you guys. I do think, as Thomas said, to be respectful on everybody's time, I think this is a great way to really kind of like, boom, kind of question here. So Greg, I'll ask you first.
Ready.
What trends do you see affecting the wine world in the next 5 to 10 years? I'm going to add to that. What else challenges?
Whoa. Okay, so from the challenges standpoint, I think, because kind of like I mentioned before, I think with the way, information is everywhere, and little bits of information can be problematic sometimes and challenging. I think, if people hold on to certain things and they run with them in weird directions, I think that can be challenging. And I'll kind of leave that one at that. And then as far as the trends, it's interesting. I think wine's been around for a super long time, right? And I think there's, when Chris was talking about Cabernet Franc, and I was asking Chris about Cabernet Franc and like why I've always kind of been intrigued, and I love the underdog thing, and then when he was talking about, it's the popularity, and you too, the past 5 years, and more and more interest for Cabernet Franc. What does that Cabernet Franc, is it in general, is it the, this kind of, beautiful kind of fashion version like this? Is it carbonic, pet nat, picked at, 10 alcohol? It can be so many different things. And I think it's a blessing and a curse sometimes. Yeah. But I think when you're striving for something that is like locked and adheres to place, I think trends and stuff don't really matter so much. I think about like Diane von Furstenberg. I think about these these designers, musicians, different things where it's like they're true to that place, they're true to that brand, they're true to that expression. And then the trends kind of come and go. You know what I mean? That's how I see it. It's a hard question. It's a good one. Carp?
Yeah, so challenges, I think there's two that we're facing on a very constant level. One's going to be with us for a very long time. The first one is obviously the ramifications of COVID and its impact on the restaurant industry and how that's ultimately going to impact the wine industry. That's going to be something to keep an eye on, and something that we're all working to try to figure out a solution to that. And the global warming and its impact on every decision we make, from how we set up a trellis system to our understanding of our responsibility as an industry to be more aware of the earth in a general sense and in a detailed sense as well. And then, fires and how that is playing out and those challenges that come with that, which is all tied into being responsible to the planet. The other part of the question, trends, I think the biggest trend, Greg and I have talked about this, and I think Greg's very keyed in on it, how wine is a fashion, right? And there's different styles that come and go. There's a consistency of style going back to clothing. You think of polo is polo. They always try to mix it up, but it's still polo, and it's been that way for 30, 40 years. And then you have like brands that come and go that have that moment, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever it happens to be. And wine is very much like that. And we go through those kind of things all the time, whether it's natural wines or unskin whites or, big fat red 16% alcohol wine, whatever it happens to be. The biggest trend, I think, is how wine is communicated. And we've been doing a lot with this, and all of you are benefiting from one of those trends right now, as we've had to deal with this change in how we as an industry present our wines. And the proliferation of influencers and their impact on wine versus critics. That's going to be a big trend that you'll keep an eye on. These kind of tastings, we as winemakers will still be out in the market because being with people is why we make wine, right? But we'll still have the opportunity to do this too, where we can't be in every market. And I think that's a great trend. And that ability to communicate and to break down those barriers that Greg was talking about earlier is an opportunity for all of us, and make people more comfortable with wine and get them to be excited like we are about it. So.
That's awesome. Phenomenal question. I think we're probably near the end of our broadcast time, unless I don't want to stretch this out for too long. I know everybody's got stuff to do. Ryan put something in the chat box about if anybody is interested in pursuing some of these wines for their own personal consumption besides a tasting, a lightning tasting in an hour and a half, you can reach out to him. And I just really want to say, you know, what an honor. Sorry, there's the dog. He's big. He's somebody outside. It was an honor and a pleasure to work with both of you. Ryan, thank you for setting it up. And what a cool contrast and what an amazing juxtaposition, but similarness of philosophies. I don't think similarness is a word, but I just made one up. If zeitgeist and stuff got used, I can make up a word. It was really an honor to be able to work with everybody today and to present to everybody virtually. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Craig.
And Tom, thank you to the whole team behind the scenes that helped us
absolutely.
here for sure. You give me way too much credit. Trust me, way too much credit.
And also, also too, please, we're all very accessible and you know how to track us all down. So, we'd love to do this again at some point. So if there are like topics or concepts or things that are of interest to explore, please let us know. We'd love to be kind of driven by your desire.
I love it. You're all my dragon lilies. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Peace.
Cheers, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.